Imagine this. You've been saving for 3 years, maybe longer. You skipped vacations. You meal prepped every Sunday. You said no to things that your friends said yes to. Concerts, weekend trips, the spontaneous stuff that makes your 20s or 30s feel alive. And you did all of that because you had a goal, a real one, a house, a place that's yours, where you can paint the walls whatever color you want, and nobody can tell you to patch the holes before you leave. So you finally feel ready. You've got your down payment sitting in a high-yield savings account. You've been pre-approved. You've been watching Zillow like it's your second job. And then you step into the market, and something feels off. The inventory is weird. The prices don't make sense. Interest rates are doing something you don't fully understand. And sellers are acting in ways that completely contradict everything you thought you knew about how this was supposed to work. And you're standing there thinking, did I miss something? Did something snap while I wasn't looking? My name is Jamie, and I spend probably way too much time thinking about real estate, money, and the strange invisible forces that shape the biggest financial decisions most people will ever make in their lives. I'm not a real estate agent. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just someone who got absolutely obsessed with understanding why the housing market behaves the way it does, and why most people, even smart, prepared people, keep getting caught off guard by it. And here's what I want you to understand by the time this video is over. Something genuinely did shift in the housing market. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with a press conference or a viral tweet. But the data is there. The patterns are there. And once you see it, you'll understand why so many buyers right now feel like they're playing a game where someone quietly changed the rules while they were standing in line. Let's get into it. So let's start here, because I think this is the thing that explains almost everything that feels confusing about the current market. And yet most people have never heard it talked about this clearly. It's called the mortgage rate lock-in effect. And it is, honestly, one of the most underappreciated forces in real estate right now. Here's how it works. Back in 2020 and 2021, mortgage rates dropped to historic lows. We're talking 2.5%, 2.7%, some people locked in below that. It felt almost unreal at the time. And millions of Americans bought homes or refinanced at those rates. Millions. We're talking somewhere around 14 million households ended up with mortgage rates below 3%. Now, fast forward to today. Rates shot up, dramatically, painfully, in a way that felt almost punishing if you were a first-time buyer trying to get in. And here's the thing nobody really prepared buyers for, those people with the 2.7% mortgages. They're not moving. Why would they? If you sell your house and buy another one, you have to give up that rate. You'd be trading a $1,400 monthly payment for something closer to $2,200 or $2,400 on a comparable home. That's not a small difference. That's a car payment. That's a kid's college savings contribution. That's real money every single month for potentially 30 years. So what happened? Sellers disappeared. Not because they don't want to move, not because they don't have reasons to move, job changes, growing families, downsizing, but because the financial math of moving became genuinely brutal. And when sellers disappear, inventory collapses. And when inventory collapses, prices don't fall. That's the part that broke a lot of buyers' brains. They heard rates are high, and they assumed the market would cool off, prices would drop, and they'd have leverage. That's what happened in 2008, right? High stress in the market equals lower prices. But that's not what happened, because 2008 was a supply glut. This was a supply drought. Two completely different problems with completely opposite outcomes. So the first thing you need to understand is this. The housing market didn't just slow down. It locked up, like a gear that seized. And that seizure affected every single person on both sides of the transaction in ways that were genuinely hard to predict. Let me give you a number that I think is important context here. At the peak of pandemic-era low rates, A $400,000 home with 20% down at a 3% interest rate cost you roughly $1,349 a month in principal and interest. That same $400,000 home at a 7% interest rate, $2,129 a month. Same house, same price. Almost $800 more every single month. That's nearly $10,000 a year in additional housing costs just because of where rates moved. And this is where I want to slow down for a second, because I think we talk about interest rates in this kind of abstract economic way that doesn't really land emotionally. But let's be real. $800 a month is enormous. That's groceries. That's a chunk of rent. That's the difference between a budget that breathes and a budget that suffocates. What this did is something I think of as the affordability cliff. Millions of people who were technically ready to buy, who had saved enough, who had decent credit, who were doing everything right, found themselves suddenly priced out. Not because home prices spiked again, but because the monthly cost of ownership crossed a threshold that their income simply couldn't support. The math stopped working, and it stopped working fast. And here's the part that I find quietly heartbreaking about all of this. The people who got hit hardest weren't the ones who were financially irresponsible. They weren't the people stretching beyond their means or chasing homes way outside their budget. They were the careful, patient, disciplined savers, the ones who did everything they were supposed to do, and they got to the edge of the water and found out the water had receded. Now, does that mean they should give up? No, absolutely not. But it does mean the strategy has to change, and we're going to talk about that. But first, there's another piece of this that I don't think gets enough attention. So we talked about why sellers aren't selling. But what about the sellers who are on the market? What's going on with them? This is where it gets genuinely strange. You'd think that if you're a seller in a low inventory market, you hold all the cards. And in some ways you do. But seller psychology has gotten really complicated in a way that's making negotiations feel almost surreal for buyers. Here's what I mean. A lot of sellers right now bought their homes at the height of the 2021 market, which was a completely bonkers time when homes were going $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 over asking, when buyers were waiving inspections and writing love letters and doing all kinds of things they probably regret. And those sellers anchored their sense of their home's value to that peak moment. So when they list now, they're listing based on what they emotionally believe their home is worth, which is tied to that 2021 high, not necessarily what the market will actually bear today. And this creates a standoff. Buyers look at the price and say, that doesn't make sense given current rates. Sellers look at offers and say, that's an insult. There's actually a behavioral economics concept that explains this perfectly. It's called loss aversion, and it's the idea that humans feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. So a seller who bought at $450,000 and is now listing at $490,000 isn't just trying to make a profit. They're psychologically protecting themselves from what feels like a loss, even if their actual equity situation is fine. The emotional math and the financial math are running on completely different software. What this means for buyers is that negotiation has become this weird dance where you have to understand not just the financial reality, but the emotional state of the person on the other side of the transaction. And honestly, the buyers who are doing well right now, who are actually closing deals, are the ones who figured out how to meet sellers somewhere in that emotional middle ground without just caving on price. Here's the part I actually want you to walk away with because I think it's the most practically useful thing I can say. The buyers who are struggling most right now are the ones still using a 2019 or 2021 playbook. They're waiting for the perfect moment. They're holding out for prices to crash. They're being too rigid about what they'll accept. And the market is not going to reward that. The market doesn't care about your timeline. The buyers who are actually making moves, who are buying homes and building equity and getting off the rental treadmill, are doing a few things differently. One, They've recalibrated their expectations around what affordable means right now. Not in a defeated way, but in a strategic way. They've asked themselves, can I buy something smaller or in a slightly different location that still gets me into the market? Because the single most expensive thing you can do in real estate over a long time horizon is stay on the sidelines. 2, they're thinking about the refinance runway. There is a very real probability, and I want to be careful not to promise anything about the future because nobody actually knows. But there's a reasonable case to be made that rates will come down meaningfully in the next few years. And if they do, people who bought in this high-rate environment will be able to refinance into something more comfortable. The phrase I keep hearing from smart buyers right now is, marry the house, date the rate, which I know sounds like a bumper sticker, but the underlying logic is actually sound. 3, and this is the one I think most people skip, they're building relationships with local agents who actually know the inventory before it hits the market. Off-market deals are more common than people realize, and they happen almost entirely through relationships. If you're just scrolling Zillow and waiting for alerts, you're competing with everyone. If you have a great agent who knows the community, you sometimes get first look. That edge is real. And 4, they've done the emotional work of separating their ego from the transaction. This is harder than it sounds. There's something psychologically difficult about buying in a market that feels unfair. You want to wait until it feels right. But markets don't feel right. They just move. And the people who are winning are the ones who've made peace with imperfect timing and decided to play anyway. So let's bring this home. Pun fully intended. The housing market snapped. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a slow, mechanical way that left millions of buyers confused, discouraged, and honestly, a little bit betrayed by a system they thought they understood. The lock-in effect dried up inventory. Rate shock crushed affordability. Seller psychology created standoffs. And the whole thing calcified into a market that felt, to a lot of people, completely unwinnable. But here's what I want you to hold on to. Markets are not permanent. What feels frozen today has always, eventually, thawed. Not on your timeline, not in the way you imagined, not without some adaptation on your part, but it thaws. And the people who come out of these difficult periods strongest are almost never the ones who waited for perfect conditions. They're the ones who stayed educated, stayed flexible, and stayed in the game long enough to catch the shift when it came. If you're a buyer right now, I don't want you to feel hopeless. I want you to feel informed. Because there's a massive difference between a market that's difficult and a market that's impossible. This one is difficult, and difficulty, when you understand it, becomes navigable. Know your local market. Not the national headlines, your local market. Know where inventory is building. Know what types of properties have softened. Know what builders are offering. Know your numbers cold so that when a deal does appear, you can move with confidence and speed, and be patient with yourself through this process. Buying a home is one of the most emotionally loaded financial decisions a person makes. It's okay for it to feel hard. It's okay for it to take longer than you planned. The 3 years you spent saving, that wasn't wasted time. That was preparation, and preparation has a way of paying off. The market snapped. But so did a lot of people's outdated assumptions about how this was all going to go. And in that clearing, in that uncomfortable space where the old playbook stops working, that's usually where the new opportunity quietly starts. You're already ahead of most people just by being curious enough to dig into this stuff. That matters more than you probably realize. Make sure to subscribe, comment, share you thought. Also make sure to like this video and see you in the next one.